Hey, welcome to episode 5. This is Mike.
Hello, this is Amanda.
In this episode, we are going to cover the period from 1650 to 1789. We're going to talk about the worldwide spread of Christianity, the awakening, science. It's going to be an interesting one. So let's get into it.
Thanks, Mike. So Christianity was super European for hundreds and hundreds of years. Obviously, the entire world wasn't yet discovered by Europeans for most of that time, but it is important to note that with the gradual discovery of the worldwide spread of Christianity happened, and it officially became a global religion. The story of Latin America and the Caribbean paints a picture of the reality of some Catholic missionary efforts, just kind of trying to find their way. In 1493, Christopher Columbus brought Christian missionaries with him to these areas. Unfortunately, this also brought church corruption with it, as the church would wind up, arguably looking past the people themselves that they were there to evangelize, like the whole reason they sent the missionaries, and they would set their interest on the potential wealth that could be found in the sugar mills on which the people worked.
Shocking.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. There's forced colonization, so like there were small areas designated to different countries, and Catholic dominance. Something is developed called the encomienda system. It took me a second to remember how to pronounce that, to be honest. In which Spain allocated to colonists, those overseeing the colonies, a number of indigenous people who would essentially be evangelized in exchange for labor. So basically, slavery. Spain saw this as a huge win. They were evangelizing people and gaining wealth through their labor at the same time. The Jesuits, however, viewed this as exploitation because it was, and they form safe spaces or like small cities for the indigenous people called reductions. The reductions were similar to monasteries in that everyone's lives were scheduled. There was scheduled time for prayer, work, rest. These were generally very successful and provided some measure of continuation of the indigenous tradition, though they are harshly criticized for attempting to evangelize and civilize indigenous people, aka, make them more European. The Jesuits were later expelled by the Catholic Church after the area is given over to Portugal, and they help the indigenous people rebel. Unfortunately, colonization happened in some other places as well. We see from this story that, Latin America and the Caribbean, we see from their story that while the idea was to share the gospel, there were some serious growing pains in Christianity's worldwide expansion. In 1622, Gregory the 15th, I'm really getting the hang of these Roman numerals, man. I so specifically remember the day in I think it was grade 3 when we opened to the Roman numerals chapter in math, and my teacher specifically was like, we don't need to know this, and we skipped it, and I've needed to know it.
It's very important.
I've very much needed to know that.
Much required for pretty much any history course prior to 1920.
Yeah, I mean, I picked up on the generals, but sometimes it takes me a minute, okay? Anyways, Pope
XV.
In 1622, Pope Gregory the 15th established the sacred... I hope that's actually right, by the way.
I laugh now. It's XV is actually 22.
I really hope not. But he established the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, known simply as the Propaganda, that sought to keep Catholic missions more within Vatican control in order to improve missionary action and better educate missionaries. In addition to the expansion of Catholic missions, we also had Orthodox missionaries from Russia moving into the east toward the Pacific Ocean. Many places in the Middle East were really difficult to reach with the gospel because of strong Islamic faith in those areas. So Christian churches were established in Vietnam, Canada, the United States, Thailand, and so on. Christian success proved a little challenging to achieve in China, however. When it landed in China, these new believers, of course, integrated their own Chinese culture into their Christianity, like you would. Some Catholics were fine with this, like the Jesuits, while others, like the Franciscans and the Dominicans, thought this wasn't really a thorough enough conversion to bring some potentially pagan cultural elements into one's Christian faith. They effectively wanted to turn Asians into Europeans, is essentially what they would have preferred. They didn't just want to evangelize them, they wanted to, it's often called, civilize them and make them more European, make them more white.
I'm shaking my head.
Yeah.
People who can't see.
Mm-hmm. It's a good, it warrants a head shake. The Jesuits respected Chinese culture and sought to share the gospel within those borders, but this was ultimately deemed counteractive to the propaganda and they were banished from China. The Chinese Emperor Kangxi took it upon himself to address this with the Pope, but he was ignored. This led to him banishing Christian missions and Christianity in general in China. Chinese citizens that practiced Christianity then were persecuted, which is really too bad. Protestantism had a strong missionary effort as well, but they made some of the same mistakes as the Catholics in trying to urge their converts to be more European. They did have some success as well, though, and figures like Nicholas Zinzendorf, Isaac Watts, Charles Wesley, and John Newton wrote hymns, many of which we would still know today, that portray the missionary vision of the day. Obviously, Christianity's global expansion is much more comprehensive than what I've just shared here, but I've chosen to highlight, these particular stories, the ones I've just shared. It seemed to be a really rough and awkward time for the European church trying to find its missionary identity, but it would play a key role in the development of later missionary efforts, which we will get to eventually. But thankfully, the church was about to experience some spiritual awakening.
Churchy, wakey, wakey.
This would mainly take place in 3 areas. So it would take place in Germany, and something called Pietism would come out of that. It would take place in England. Something called the Evangelical Revival would come out of that. And it would take place in North America, and the Great Awakening would come out of it. So we'll start by talking about Germany. A man named Philip Spener sought to revitalize the church with more genuine, heart-enriching preaching. He thought German Lutheranism, the group that he would have affiliated with, felt a bit rigid and focused on the head instead of the heart. He wanted to see Christians thriving in individual relationships with Christ and would engage in personal Bible study. He wanted to encourage other Christians to engage in personal Bible study. He thought this piety would be enriching for the entire church, so he established a house church, and Pietism was born from there. Spener's follower Hermann Francke assisted his teachings by inspiring the joy of the Christian life. Pietism would establish orphanages, homes for widows and unmarried women, centers for missionary training, and so on. Nicholas Zinzendorf studied under these 2 men as well, and he taught that Christianity was intended to be a simple, childlike faith. Pietism emphatically adds to orthodoxy and orthopraxy, the practical care for souls, and the personal devotional faith of the average layperson. He encouraged small group gatherings and sharing theology and love for God through music. Their major theme was regeneration, the new life in Christ and the experience of this new life. They believed they were fulfilling the true heart of the Protestant Reformation. Next, we'll move to England. We'll move from Germany to England, where Zinzendorf's ideas spread. And many believed that reason had made the church very dull and dry, like it was kind of missing its heart and soul. It was like too much in the head and kind of missing the heart kind of thing. A key figure in this was Susanna Wesley, the woman who raised 19 children that included
You might as well have one more at that
Yeah,
point.
I know. Just round it
What's
up to
one more?
20, man. Just have little Tommy and just call it a day. But among her
Throw
19
a couple
children,
letters after the name, like Tom V.
Yeah, that's true too. Out of her 19 children, they included Charles and John Wesley. So she instilled a deep personal. She instilled.
I was gonna let that one pass, but he's gone back.
It's
to
like
it.
whenever I lead, so will I. I
100
always
dillion
sing
times.
100 dilly. Oh my gosh. So Susanna Wesley instilled a deep personal faith into her children, praying with them and teaching them scripture. And she even attracted her neighbors in doing so. She would kind of have little meetings and like in and around her house, and it would kind of attract her neighbors. Her husband was minister, and he wasn't super happy that his wife was, kind of outshining him in a way. Like, she was really ministering well. But she didn't care about what he thought and carried on. Good for her. She would go on to be called the mother of Methodism. Her son later in life said something along the lines of, I believe this is a quote from John. He said, "How could I ever marry? No one could compare to the kind of woman my mother was." At one point, John and Charles found themselves on a ship. John was the chaplain of the ship, and the ship was actually destined to a missionary journey in Georgia in the United States. During a storm, the boat was on the brink of going down. Everyone on board basically thought it was going to sink. He was terrified, but a group on the ship were peacefully singing psalms, completely unafraid of death, fully at peace with God as the ship began to break apart. Everyone was okay after, thankfully, but this experience changed John and impacted the way he lived with God and shared the gospel with others. He and Charles would find themselves within the evangelical revival movement, preaching their new revelation of the faith, with both of them being prolific hymn writers, especially Charles. Many say these hymns are the greatest legacy of the revival. The Wesley hymnal catalog includes "Oh, for a Thousand Tongues to Sing."
Oh, for a thousand
Yeah.
tongues.
That's the one. That was him. "Hark the Herald Angels Sing."
Hark the herald.
As if that don't bring you right
Yeah.
back to Charlie Brown Christmas, right?
Oh yeah.
So good. "Come Thou Long Expected Jesus."
Don't know that. I definitely do, but I don't know.
You
the tune
probably
to it.
do, yeah. And so on. He wrote a lot. He preached among the poor in jails. They preached among the poor and they preached in jails. Although the Wesley brothers were Anglican, this movement of theirs came to be known as Methodism, which is something that started as a clever nickname because of John's methods of spiritual improvement, but clearly it stuck. And this denomination still exists today. In North America, they shared a similar story in that they felt their Protestant faith had stagnated. An incredibly important figure here is Jonathan Edwards, as he was the one who really helped spark the Great Awakening and is now considered the father of mass evangelism. In the 1730s and 40s, New England in particular was experiencing a lot of revival. There were thousands showing up for outdoor church services. George Whitefield, an incredibly vivid preacher, helped with this, reaching thousands of people as well with the gospel. Canada wasn't forgotten in this either, so revivalist preachers such as Henry Alline brought the message north as well, to, what would now be considered Canada. Overall, the awakening was very impactful for the church as a whole moving forward, birthing what we know in North America as, kind of an evangelical, charismatic movement, and helping to introduce the idea of sharing testimony and conversion stories. Thousands upon thousands of people were saved during this time. So it was a boom.
Boom.
There's a lot of little booms throughout Christian history. Now, a really interesting conversation to also have in the scope of modern Christian history is the interaction between Christianity and science, particularly the scientific revolution. It's a stretch to say the scientific revolution was a Protestant movement, as some people try to argue, but a lot of Protestants played a role, as a lot of early scientists were Christians. A lot of Protestants were scientists. The 16th to 18th centuries saw an incredibly significant shift in Western thought. James R. Moore says this, quote, "In religion, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and Knox were replacing a human-centered view of the world with a God-centered one. In science, Copernicus, Galileo, Bray, Kepler, and Newton were replacing a universe centered on the earth with one centered on the sun. A religious reformation and a scientific revolution went hand in hand." Historians link the Christian Science connection to some different theologies and church teachings, ultimately pointing to another quote from Moore: "The demand that nature should be studied systematically, rationally, and experimentally for the glory of God and the good of humankind." So, there were some Christian theologies out there that promoted this idea of it's good to study creation. Science
I
is a
have to
good
agree.
thing. Science is good.
Science is good.
Science helps us know stuff.
Watch your Kratz Creatures and Bill Nye.
Yeah, and I mean, if anything, like if obviously some Christians have been and still are like threatened by science, but I think science.
But then
like,
there's also some Christians that are making big headway in science,
no, totally.
which is kind of cool.
Yeah, for sure. And like science really helps reveal like the complexity of the world, and I think that like for me that really helps to point to the existence of God, because how can something so complex just have appeared? Yeah, that doesn't make sense to me. I think that for me takes more faith to believe that we just came from a big bang and it's all pointless and like a super, super big fluke that we're here.
Or you can just take that same statement and be like, God created the universe with a big bang.
Yeah. Yeah. Ugh.
Cool.
It's a wild one. It's a very interesting, the science piece. So another massive shift in Western thought would come with the Enlightenment, or the rise of rationalism. This one's also super interesting. So rationalism is basically just the use of reason in processing information and making decisions instead of using emotions or feelings. Rationalism placed emphasis on facts and hard evidence. This one would prove intimidating for the church, as plenty of secular philosophical thinkers, such as Immanuel Kant and David Hume, would rise up and challenge not only Christian beliefs, but the very existence of God. However, there were also Christian apologetic thinkers who countered their skeptical arguments in an attempt to reasonably prove the existence of God, such as René Descartes and Blaise Pascal. This movement gave rise to ideas such as deism, an acknowledgement that God exists but doesn't have anything to do with the universe or humanity. Thinkers such as Gotthold Ephraim Lessing even believed he was enlightened in believing that Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are all relative and will eventually amalgamate into, or, be superseded, probably better to say that, by a universal religion. Unfortunately, some so-called enlightened thinkers seem to believe that they had a superior knowledge, or that at least what they did not know was not even worth knowing. This movement is a really interesting one, but it places so much weight on the human mind, which is obviously limited. Like if God is truly God, all-powerful, all-knowing, all that stuff, how can a mere human being actually have the capacity to figure him out? He's obviously, he's not on our level of being, so I personally believe that there's only so much we can know. Either way, this movement ultimately led to some governments, such as America, cutting ties with a formal religious partnership, if you can call it that, like Christendom kind of thing, in that they couldn't mandate citizens to be Christians or declare Christianity as their official state religion. Religious neutrality was the new thing. In France, religious neutrality didn't seem to extend to Christians as a religion of reason was introduced.
So wait, let's go back a point there.
Yeah.
So at some point in the States, they could make you be Christian?
Well,
or was it more of like we're the United States and we're Christian?
well, like the United States is obviously based a nice bit in Christianity. But like the idea is that they made this like firm decision. Like I honestly don't know if the United States was like Europe, in that like every person that was born was baptized, that kind of thing.
Yeah, okay.
Like I don't know if America was ever like that, but they did make that firm. They did take that firm stance towards like religious neutrality, religious freedom. Like we are not going to tell you what to believe. You can believe what you'd like.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, like religious neutrality was the new thing. Obviously, this is a significant shift from the Christian dominance we've seen play out for hundreds and hundreds of years, like in Europe, like I just said. So, in the next episode, we'll be talking about social reform. We're going to talk about another awakening, the Second Great Awakening. We're going to talk about deepening skepticism. We're going to talk about missions. Missions was huge within this next period. And we're going to talk about, my dear friend, Pentecostalism. We will see you in the next one, folks.
Bye.
Bye.